Starting with the first part of this topic, 1.1, structure of ATP. So there's two things that you need to know in this part: the diagram of the ATP and the description of ATP. So we'll start with this description and then we'll go on to the diagram. First of all, ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. The adenosine would indicate the presence of the nitrogen base, adenine, connected to the ribose sugar. The tri indicates the presence of three phosphate groups, and the phosphate is basically saying that there's a phosphate group. So we know that ATP is a phosphorylated nucleotide. It's made up of nitrogen base, specifically adenine. It's made up of a ribose sugar. You could also say that it's made up of a pentose sugar, or just say both to stay in the safe zone. And then finally, three phosphate groups. But remember something, you need to say 3 and not 3 as a number, because you get a negative mark for saying 3 and not 3 as in words, because the marking scheme always has stuff underlined, and whatever is underlined is the only accepted option. So in case you go write 3 phosphate groups as in a number, you're gonna lose that mark, or at least it's not gonna be accepted. So please write 3 as in words. Right, so this part of the answer usually carries about 3 marks if it was asked. So make sure that you write everything, not just the ones that you feel familiar with. Just write everything to ensure that you get your marks. Now we're going to be looking into the diagram of the ATP. So, as I said before, it's made up of ribose sugar. So this is ribose sugar, and it's connected to a nitrogen base. Thus, as we said here before, it's called a phosphorylated nucleotide. Why is it a phosphorylated nucleotide? It's because we have a nitrogen base and we have 3 phosphate groups, so it's a phosphorylated nucleotide. Right? So the adenine here is called a nitrogen base. So a nitrogen base connected to a ribose sugar is called adenosine. So this is going to be called adenosine. When we add one phosphate group, it's going to be called adenosine monophosphate, because it's this structure which is called adenosine, and one phosphate which is monophosphate. In short form, it's going to be called AMP. Alright, so the first part is going to be called AMP, which is adenosine monophosphate. What if we add another phosphate group to it? It's going to be called adenosine diphosphate, where di indicates the presence of 2 phosphate groups. So in short form, it's ADP. And finally, 3 phosphate groups is adenosine triphosphate, where tri indicates the presence of 3 phosphate groups. And as I had said before, please mention 3 as in words, not in numbers. So it's going to be ATP. Before we move into bond energy, you need to know how is ATP used or utilized within the body. So in a very simple explanation, because we'll go into that in details later on, ATP needs to change into ADP in order to release energy. So how will that happen? ATP changes into ADP plus PI, releasing energy. What does that mean? It means that the body does not directly use ATP. The hydrolysis of ATP releases energy, which is then later used into the body functions. So here, this is hydrolysis. On hydrolysis of ATP, it releases ADP, a PI, which is a phosphate, it's an inorganic phosphate, and energy. So this would happen in, for example, like in an organ. in an organ, which would require the energy, or like organelle inside the cell, or a specific metabolic reaction. But if I keep using ATP and changing it into ADP to PI to release energy, wouldn't the ATP run out? I mean, it would if it's not regenerated, but luckily our body would regenerate the ATP into the ATP again. How will this happen? So basically, this happens in respiration. In respiration, it would take the ADP and then it would ADP, I'm sorry. It would take the ATP and then it would add an inorganic phosphate, and the energy from the respiration would convert it into ATP, which is then regenerated. So as you can see here, when we break the third phosphate bond, this is the first one, this is the second, and this is the third. When we break the third phosphate bond, we would release the phosphate, which you could see here. I'm sorry, here. We will release energy. But how much energy would be released from breaking the third bond? It's gonna be 30.5 kilojoules per mole. And of course, the ATP and the PI. So now you know where this energy came from and how it's gonna be regenerated back. What if we ran out of energy and we cannot regenerate it because, for example, you're starving? The body would have to go and they would have to break the second phosphate bond in order to release energy for example, your brain function, your body functions, and so on, for you to survive. We would go and break the second bond. It would also release 30.5 kilojoules per mole. But in this case, it would then release an AMP, which is adenosine monophosphate, and a phosphate group. But why did the second bond also release 30.5, similar to the third one? It's because the bonds between a phosphate and a phosphate groups always carry the same bond energy. What if we're still starving? What if we're lost in a desert? We don't have any energy income from like our food or anything. Our body's gonna go and break the first and final phosphate bond. But in this case, its energy, the bond energy is gonna change. If you ask me, why would it change? It's because in these examples, the bond was between two phosphate groups. But here, it's between the ribose sugar and a phosphate. So the bond energy is gonna decrease. So in breaking or hydrolysis of this bond, it's gonna release 14.2 kilojoules per mole. And finally, an adenosine and a PI. All of the bonds, like all of the bonds between the phosphates, and even between the nitrogen base and the ribose sugar, they're all considered covalent bonds. So now, as you can see, we're done with the first part of respiration, 1.1, the structure of the ATP.